Ladies and gentlemen, give this bike a good listen, because this is definitely going to be the last day you'll hear this thing running for a long time. Because if you think I took this thing apart hardcore to get it back here to begin with, oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. Yeah, but first we gotta see if the engine is even worth breathing on, because even though the engine feels pretty fine while riding the bike, you never really know what's going on in between those engine cases, because sometimes the piston rings are fried and you and the mad scientist gotta rip apart the block to... Okay, that joke is not even really funny anymore. Before we go in, I just want to take a second to acknowledge that I made it to 40k subscribers, and just like I did when I hit 20k, I've made a new button-proof run of stickers available on Teespring. They finally added the die cut option, which means that you don't have to just go with boring pre-shaped rectangles. The link to those are in the description. If you see them and you like them, you want to buy a few. It's always appreciated. Subs don't mean much, so thank you to those who actually watch all the way through and interact with my videos, because it really helps out a lot. Also, a very benevolent viewer actually donated some money for the build, which took me for a surprise. And he says that crediting him isn't necessary, so here's another anonymous thank you. You know who you are. So, the compression test. Well, a compression test is basically when you hook up a pressure gauge with the same threads as the spark plugs, and you dry run the engine in order to get an idea of whether or not each piston is actually compressing air fuel well, or if there's pressure escaping somehow. You will either learn all or just some of these three things. A, if your valves are in spec or not. B, if your piston rings are frag. Or if you have a blown head gasket and somehow didn't notice. If anything is wrong, you hope that it's the valves, because you just adjust them and that's it. Although they could be bent or chipped, but anyway. On March 4th, I had some help to conduct a compression test on the K100. So I went to Advanced Auto and I bought a very, very expensive compression test kit for 50 bucks. I guess there's no price tag for peace of mind, is there? After letting my assistant fiddle around with that super ridiculous seat latch for my amusement, I had to remove a bunch of things from the bike that would never actually get put back on, just so that there would be less shit to look at on this rusty lump of metal. Before you do the compression test, you gotta warm up the motor to make sure that the piston rings are nice and expanded and the engine is under normal operating circumstances. This left side cover inside of the valve cover is actually where the spark plugs are hidden. But even with the cover, it was still freaking filthy in it, which you'll find is actually the constant theme for this bike at the moment. Filth. The spark plug coil connectors was stuck in there pretty good and required tools to get them out, and it became pretty obvious that this was because of the corrosion that was inside of them. Like you know that white and green stuff that you see on an old battery that's been inside of an electronic thing for too long. But we got all of them out and we made sure to label them accordingly to which cylinder that they came out of. Same thing with the spark plugs themselves, which are a little bit oily, probably because the side stand issue that this bike has, where it kind of like very lightly seeps into the head, because obviously that's the lowest point besides the oil pan when it's leaned over. We cleaned off the inner area where the spark plugs are inserted to avoid any crud from falling directly into the cylinders, since they would be exposed. In order to do the compression test, you gotta take the appropriately sized adapter into the spark plug hole. So you kind of thread it in there, then you hook up your gauge to it via a hose, and then one by one you find out how much compression each cylinder is making. The gauge already has a reading on it in the video right now, because by this point we had already done the frontmost cylinder, which is actually cylinder 4. You free up the pressure by pressing a little button on the side, turn on the ignition on the bike, and you do something with the coil leads. I mean, I say something because we spent like 20 minutes trying to figure out how to safely deal with the coil leads to avoid electricity, you know, arcing around and maybe igniting some gas that comes out of the cylinders since they're open. But in the end, we just kind of let them hang there anyway. You hold the throttle all the way open because you want the engine to be pulling in air fuel to build up pressure. So last but not least, you crank the starter until the gauge won't climb anymore. You keep doing that until the gauge won't climb up anymore, and that's your max compression for that specific cylinder. Cylinder 3 was 165 psi, and cylinder 4, which we did off camera, was also 165 psi, which is fantastic and definitely within BMW spec. So we did the whole thing again for cylinder 2. And cylinder 2 got an even better 170 psi. Yep. And at this point, the bike had started to really impress me, because I was prepared to rebuild the entire engine, but it started to look like the bottom end didn't even need to be touched. So we moved on to the last cylinder, and the battery died on us.
The battery?
Yeah, the battery. Yeah, it looked like it was still climbing, so I think we're fine. When the gauge got up to about 140, 145. But like I said, it looked like it was still climbing while the battery was conking out. So I rehooked up all of the spark plugs, and since the cylinders were all primed up with fuel during the tests, it started up with zero effort, even with the practically dead battery. It was almost scary how fast it started up. So I ran it for maybe 10 minutes to get a little bit more juice into the battery through the, the alternator. And so I took everything off again and I ran another test and actually managed to get it up to 155. But again, it was still climbing, so I basically just rounded it up to 160. And even then, that's on a conservative side because I have no reason to believe that it wouldn't hit 165 like most of them did. So what you're looking for here is consistency between all of the cylinders, which I was actually seeing. And it's also great because the brick was actually doing numbers of a really healthy example too. After putting away all the parts that I didn't need, I decided that yes, I would go ahead and put some time into this particular brick instead of trying to find one on eBay. My next day off was Thursday the 7th, and that's when I had planned to rip fully into this thing. But the famous pile of planks wasn't gonna cut it this time, you know, to hold up the engine. I would need an actual mini lift like they kind of, you know, like the ones that they use with dirt bikes when they're racing. So I ordered a super cheap one off of Amazon, as well as a dolly to replace the broken one with the money that was graciously given to me by that viewer. Thank you again. In case I wouldn't, you know, just in case I would need to roll anything around the yard or around the basement, it would be brick as hell on the 7th, but the thing is, it would at least be dry. So let's get ready to go for it. So that Thursday, I started wrenching at 9 a.m. or so. I started off the session by freaking out. Absolutely freaking out, man. Let me explain. So I've never removed a battery from a bike with so many terminal connections before in my life. The thing is, I didn't pay attention or take a picture of what was connected to what, and the leads were not even color coded. You know, red positive, black negative. And remember, the battery was still dead from the compression test. So when I would try to, you know, make the connections to retrace my steps, nothing would happen, which made me even more anxious about the whole thing. So I just plugged the battery into the wall, and I just went out and ran a few errands. And I came back after like just an hour, like just over an hour, and the charger was indicating that the battery was fully charged. Like, I'm like, all right, well, this battery is trash. I managed to find the correct connections for the battery though after, you know, cooling off. One of the cluster connections was for a battery trickle charger, which I pretty much knew, and that's cool because I got one for free. And then this is actually like an accessory outlet, you know, like the lighted thing that you find in cars. Upon further research, this was actually a factory option back then, you know, for accessories. Like they had like a heated vest or something like that, which is pretty cool. But that's actually not necessary at all for the bike to run, as it's a closed system with no connection to the harness, only a direct connection, you know, direct 12-volt connection to the battery. The positive lead starts on the negative side of the battery, and it's black, which confused me. But it is the positive lead. And the negative wire grounds directly to the transmission under. So I only had to connect 2 connections, and the bike started right up, which is great because I needed to warm up the oil before I drained it, because that makes it drain faster. Now, this situation very quickly taught me that I'm gonna need to label every single thing that I disconnect on this bike, because it's gonna get much more confusing than just the battery. For example, the fuse block is entirely in German. Great. Okay, enough stalling. Time to get this engine out of this frame, or should I say get this frame off this engine, because remember from my crash course video, the frame actually comes off of the running gear itself, straight off the top. So, step 1, let's get that gas tank off. You have 3 connections, the actual fuel line, the electrical connection for the pump and the gas level unit, and some kind of vacuum or vent hose at the front. I'll label the fuel line rail with the backwards arrow because it connects directly to the fuel rail and is behind the other hose. In order to disconnect the tank without gas running all over the place, relieve the pressure of the system by running the engine and then shutting off the pump by simply unplugging it from the harness. Easy. Remove the lines and just lift the tank up. Whoa, too far. Step 2, drain the oil. Easy peasy, baby. Vent the filler cap off, break that drain bolt loose, and watch that hot chocolate flow from your brick. The oil was very murky, but luckily there was no coolant in there, which tends to be an issue for these bikes sometimes. We're not gonna bother with the fuel filter, which is inside of that circular cover, because we aren't refilling it. By this point, I was curious to see if the oil sensor or even just the light itself was working. And yes, the sensor was picking up that the engine was drier than my knuckles. All right, step 3, remove the battery. Easy. This time. Goddamn, son, I can't wait to get that lithium battery because this bitch is big and heavy. Oh yeah, that's the fuel injection brain. Well, the FICO, fuel injection control unit. There's an actual like circuit board in there, and it's pretty cool, but it needs to come off for now. Step 4, coolant. Vent the radiator filler cap, just open that drain bolt, and I only have one drain tub, so I had to get rid of the oil that was in there first. Just don't be a fool and miss the shot into the tub like I did. I actually have a dog who roams this backyard, and coolant smells and tastes good to dogs, but obviously and unfortunately it's very deadly. So before I proceed, I made sure to clean it all up good for, you know, for her sake. Next step was to finally remove that dingy old exhaust, and boy oh boy was it a battle of man versus rust. I knew that all 8 bolts under there would need 8 tons of WD-40 because they look looked like absolute shit. So I gave them a few coats of the Lubie Boy, which made them look even more like shit, but the important part was that they don't break off in the block and cause me unnecessary problems. It took 3 different tools to get up in the nooks and crannies of the pipes, and the WD-40 was just making a huge mess. The main culprit was the rear bolt of the cylinder number 1, which actually got about 90% stripped before it finally broke free. It was a super hype moment because the metal almost gave out before the threads did. I removed the other loosened ones and pow! This pile of rust fell out and almost just gave me tetanus from looking at it. These pipes are not really usable because not only has the lowest pipe rusted through, probably from water sitting inside of it, but you can also see the dents from where the exhaust was crushed when we had to carry it through the house over staircases and whatnot. That was the main reason I left it attached when we lifted up the bike and carried it, because it basically served as a cushion, which it definitely did, as you can see. I then noticed just how filthy the underside of the head was, as well as the fact that the exhaust ports were now exposed to said filth. So I stuffed the ports with a few clean rags and gave the area a quick clean. Nothing serious, just some tar cleaner and a cloth. It was pretty grimy, and I'm not too sure if this oil pan was painted black from the factory or if it was done by the previous owner, because the paint actually scratched off quite easily. Hell, maybe this cleaner is just that harsh. Not sure. Now the mini lift that I bought could actually be balanced under the engine with the exhaust out of the way. So now we're really in business because we get to jack this thing up, start taking things apart. Next, we start attaching things that are attached to both the running gear, that's the engine, the bell housing, the transmission, the swing arm, and the final drive thingy, and the frame itself. That way we can free the frame with, you know, as few parts as possible removed. First is the coil leads for the ignition system, and by extension that accessory port unit. The accessory port was easy, but I had to take note of which color wires went where for the coils, because it's like a fucking rainbow under there. The wires only had to be unplugged, the coils can actually stay there. After that, I started to just unplug and label a few odds and ends on the electrical system, you know, like the brake light, the gear indicator, and guess what? I even found a connection for the speedo, but it was fucking unplugged. I couldn't believe that the problem was that simple, and unfortunately the battery was still disconnected and dead, so I couldn't even test if it was actually that simple, you know? I then disconnected the connections to the fuel injectors themselves, but unfortunately the plastic was so old and brittle that every one of them, including the choke indicator, broke. The connection would be fine, but they just won't clip in, so I guess I'm replacing that too. I began preparing to remove the radiator as well, but that turned out to be a bit trickier than I thought. We'll get back to that. Took the airbox snorkel off, and then I went after the elephant in the room, that big old shock in the back. I just love how easy it is to get the shock off on this bike because, you know, I'm so used to sport bikes with it, you know, tucked under the bike between exhaust pipes and whatnot. You don't want to let the swing arm drop on these things, so you got to put a jack under the final drive because they're so heavy that they can actually crack the transmission if you just let it, boom, you know, let it drop to the bottom. Now, I make one final check with a shop manual, and I'm like, okay then, I'm ready to start yanking this frame off, right? Wrong! But you know what? I'm gonna leave my series of blunders in this video for your entertainment. So these are the 5 bolts that keep the frame attached to the running gear. There's 2 connected to the engine and 3 in the back connected to the transmission. So I remove like 2 or 3 while keeping the other ones loosened so I can just, you know, wiggle the frame and test out the weight without, you know, actually committing to taking it off. You know, so just to see if I need help with it or anything. Nah, seems pretty light, especially considering I can leave the front wheel on the ground like a wheelbarrow. But wait, the last frame bolt is actually hidden behind the radiator. Fuck, guess that's gotta come off too. And did I spill any dog-killing coolant on the ground? You bet your sweet ass I did. Okay, ready for that magnificent moment where the frame lifts off the— Nope. Oh, the choke cable was still connected. Okay, fair enough, that's important. All right, you ready for that magnificent— Nope. The throttle cable. Okay. Okay, you ready? Nope. And then the camera died. And if that wasn't bad enough, the oil light sensor and some other wire to the timing cover was still attached. Well, the bright side is that the camera died on a failure round. So I removed the wires and I changed the camera batteries. Okay, 5th time's a charm, innit? Nope. Man, I was ready to fling this fucking bike over the fence. But nah, one of the wires just got tangled up on the engine. We're good. So why did I fall apart here? Well, the thing is, the manual gave a list of things to look for before you remove the frame, and I made sure of all of the things that the manual listed were disconnected, but it didn't really give a complete checklist. See, it was just long enough to seem complete, but it wasn't actually a full list, so I just forgot about those things like an absolute chode. So this is where we are with this now. A steaming, filthy, dingy running gear jacked up on a lift, the center stand, and a scissor jack. The engine, the bell housing, transmission, swing arm, final drive with the shock still attached. The ignition system and the intake system are still attached. But the entire harness is actually still attached to the frame, which is great because I don't even want to think about the electrical system anytime soon. Shit, that might be an episode unto itself. I'm going to leave the frame alone for now and just focus on cleaning and restoring the running gear of the bike. So we'll do that part next time. It's going to be gross as hell, but I imagine it'll be extremely satisfying to see the difference. Plus, the bike might actually lose like 10 pounds of weight in just road grime alone. People were asking me how I plan to get the bike out of the backyard, and as you can see, I pretty much know how to really take this thing apart into pieces, which means it can be assembled outside piece by piece. The plan is to restore the running gear, do maintenance and modifications to it, and then partially reassemble it just enough out front to roll it to a fabrication shop that I've visited before in order to get some frame mods done. Then I'll bring it back and continue with the build, and obviously at some point things will start getting powder coated, all of that type of stuff, but that will probably be like, 2 or 3 weeks out because I'm still buying the parts that I need. I can assure you that next episode will definitely consist of me getting this running gear spotless. Man, I'm probably gonna need a respirator for this. So thank you to everyone who purchased stickers so far from the Instagram post that I made, because you bet your ass that money is going straight into this build. The weather is slated to be pretty decent, so being outside won't be as stressful because actually when I worked on it this time, I think it was below freezing. But yeah, that's all for today. Just be happy that you don't have to stick around for the cleanup. I'll catch you guys in episode 3.